For the first 2 years of the Pacific War, the Japanese merchant marine operated with a distinct advantage: they could see the bullets coming. The standard American submarine weapon was the Mark 14 torpedo. It was a steam-powered machine. It burned alcohol and compressed air to spin its turbines. This combustion created exhaust. As the torpedo raced through the water at 46 knots, it left a massive, frothing trail of white bubbles on the surface. It looked like a finger drawing a line on the ocean: "Here I am." Japanese lookouts were trained to spot this wake. "Torpedo, starboard!" The Japanese captain would simply turn his ship, combing the tracks, turning parallel to the torpedoes so they passed harmlessly by. Or, if it was a destroyer, it would follow the white line back to its source and drop depth charges on the American submarine. The Japanese commanders mocked the American technology. They called the Mark 14 the White Snake. They believed that American engineering was clumsy. They felt safe because the element of surprise was impossible with a weapon that announced its arrival 10 seconds before impact. Submarine captains like Mush Morton and Dicker Kane would set up perfect shots, fire, and watch in frustration as the Japanese ships leisurely turned out of the way. That silent service was being betrayed by a weapon that was too loud. The Japanese grew arrogant. They stopped zigzagging. They sailed in straight lines, confident that their lookouts would spot the bubbles in time. They didn't know that the bubbles were about to disappear. Even when the Japanese didn't dodge, they were often safe. The Mark 14 had a magnetic exploder that fired too early, and a contact exploder that failed on impact. It was the Great Torpedo Scandal. Japanese tanker crews would sometimes hear a loud, metallic clang against the side of their ship. They would rush to the rail and see a dent in the steel plates. Or they would see a broken American torpedo sinking into the deep. They laughed. "The Americans are firing logs at us," they joked. This reinforced the Japanese belief in their own invincibility. They believed that the American spirit was weak and their manufacturing was shoddy. They didn't bother to upgrade their anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Why spend money on sonar when the enemy torpedoes don't work? This complacency was fatal. Because while the Japanese were laughing at the duds, the Americans were stealing a better idea. Across the world, in the Atlantic, the Germans were using a weapon that terrified the British, the G7E electric torpedo. It didn't use steam. It used batteries. It left no wake. The Americans captured several of these German torpedoes. They sent them to the Westinghouse Electric Company with a simple order: copy this. Make it American. And make it work. The Japanese commanders thought they were fighting American ingenuity, which they despised. They didn't realize they were about to be fighting German engineering, which they respected, mass-produced by American factories. The birth of the Mark 18 electric torpedo was a feat of reverse engineering. The German G7E was a good weapon, but it was complex. Westinghouse simplified it. They replaced the German batteries with American lead-acid cells, similar to car batteries, but massive. They built a new electric motor. The resulting weapon, the Mark 18, was different from the Mark 14 in every way. It was slower. It traveled at only 29 knots, compared to the Mark 14's 46 knots. It had a shorter range. But it had one supreme advantage: stealth. It was electric. It produced no exhaust. When it was fired, it swam through the water with a low hum. There were no bubbles. No white streak. It was an invisible assassin. The U.S. Navy rushed it into production. By late 1943, the first Mark 18s were being loaded into the tubes of submarines like the USS Wahoo and USS Tang. The submarine crews were skeptical at first. "It's too slow," they complained. "The Jap ships will run away from it." They were used to the speed of steam. They didn't trust the heavy, batter-filled tubes that required constant maintenance and vented dangerous hydrogen gas into the torpedo room. But Admiral Lockwood, the submarine force commander, insisted. He knew that the Japanese defensive doctrine relied entirely on visual spotting. If you took away their eyes, they were defenseless. The German gift was loaded into the breeches. The stage was set for a new kind of war. The first time a Japanese convoy encountered the Mark 18, the confusion was absolute. It was late 1943. A Japanese tanker was steaming through the calm waters of the Pacific. The lookouts were vigilant. They scanned the water for periscopes and the telltale white wake of a steam torpedo. The sea was blue and unbroken. The captain felt secure. 1,000 yards away, submerged, an American submarine fired a Mark 18. The torpedo left the tube. It ran straight and true. On the surface, nothing. No streak. No disturbance. The torpedo closed the distance. The Japanese lookouts saw nothing. They didn't sound the alarm. The ship didn't turn. Boom! The explosion ripped the tanker open amidships. The crew was stunned. They hadn't seen a plane. They hadn't seen a submarine. They hadn't seen a wake. "Mine!" the captain shouted. "We hit a mine." They radioed a warning to the rest of the convoy, "Minefield." The other ships slowed down or stopped to avoid the mines. This was exactly what the American submarine captain wanted. He reloaded and fired again. And again. Ships began to explode one by one. The Japanese destroyers raced around in circles, dropping depth charges at random. They couldn't find the source of the attack because there were no tracks to follow back to the sub. The wakeless torpedo had removed the enemy's ability to react. The Japanese commanders, reading the reports of mystery explosions, were slow to understand what was happening. They didn't know the Americans had switched technologies. They continued to train their lookouts to look for bubbles. But the bubbles were gone. The ocean had become a place of invisible death. The Mark 18 turned the hunter-prey dynamic on its head. The slower torpedo was actually deadlier because the target never knew it was coming until the steel shattered. Throughout 1944, a strange sickness began to afflict Japanese convoys. A convoy of 10 transport ships and 3 escort destroyers would be sailing under clear skies. No American planes on radar. No periscopes sighted. Suddenly, the lead cargo ship would explode. A column of water and debris would shoot hundreds of feet into the air. The ship's back would break, and it would begin to sink within minutes. Chaos erupted on the bridge of the escort commander's ship. Where did it come from? The lookouts would be screaming, pointing at the water. But there was nothing to point at. No white bubble trail. no wake. This lack of visual evidence was paralyzing. If you see a torpedo wake coming from the east, you turn west, and your destroyers run east to find the submarine. If you see nothing, you don't know which way to turn. Japanese captains often made the fatal mistake of assuming they had hit a drifting mine. They would slow down. They would stop zigzagging to avoid running into another mine. This made them perfect targets. The American submarine, sitting quietly at periscope depth, would take its time. The captain would line up his next shot. He didn't have to worry about the target suddenly turning. The Mark 18 torpedoes were fired methodically, one after another. In the chaos, ships would collide with each other. Destroyers would fire at whales or floating debris. The panic was amplified by the silence before the explosion. The Japanese sailor knew that death could arrive at any second, from any direction, without warning. The psychological toll was immense. Crews became jumpy and ineffective. The Mark 18 didn't just sink ships, it destroyed the cohesion of the convoy system. It turned a disciplined formation into a panicked mob. The initial skepticism of American submarine crews about the Mark 18 speed was rooted in a misunderstanding of the new tactical reality. They thought faster is better. A fast torpedo gives the target less time to move. But the Mark 18 proved a different mathematical truth: stealth beats speed. A Mark 14 steam torpedo traveling at 46 knots covers 2,000 yards in roughly 78 seconds. But the moment it leaves the tube, it announces its presence with a massive bubble wake. A sharp Japanese lookout could spot the firing puff and the wake almost instantly. This gave the Japanese ship about a minute to turn. A destroyer could turn 90 degrees in that time. A large tanker could turn 30 or 40 degrees, enough to make the torpedo miss. The Mark 18 traveling at 29 knots took much longer to cover the distance, about 124 seconds for 2,000 yards. That's 2 full minutes. But because it was invisible, the Japanese target spent those 2 minutes sailing in a straight line. The American captain didn't need to predict a complex evasive turn. He just had to calculate the simple lead angle for a steady target. The hit rate skyrocketed. American captains, like the legendary Mush Morton of the USS Wahoo, became converts. They realized that the slow, silent torpedo allowed them to get closer without being detected. Instead of firing long-range Hail Mary shots, they could sneak into point-blank range, less than 1,000 yards, and deliver a knockout blow that was impossible to miss. The Mark 18 forced a change in American submarine doctrine. It became a weapon of infiltration and ambush, rather than long-range sniping. The Japanese mocked the Americans for losing their speed. They didn't realize the Americans had traded speed for certainty. The Mark 18 was a devastating weapon, but it had a dark side. It was moody, complex, and sometimes suicidal. The most famous tragedy involved the USS Tang, commanded by the ace Dick O'Kane. On the night of October 24, 1944, in the Formosa Strait, the Tang was having an incredible patrol. It had already sunk several Japanese ships. O'Kane fired his final Mark 18 torpedo at a crippled transport. The torpedo left the tube perfectly. Then, something went wrong with its gyroscope or rudder mechanism. Instead of running straight, the torpedo began to turn left. On the bridge of the Tang, O'Kane and his lookouts watched in horror. The torpedo was weaving, but maintaining a tight, circular turn. It was coming back. Kane ordered emergency speed to try and get out of the way. But the Mark 18 was relentless. It completed a perfect 360-degree circle. It struck the stern of the USS Tang. The explosion was massive. The aft torpedo room was instantly flooded, killing everyone there. The submarine sank by the stern in 180 feet of water. Kane and 8 others on the bridge were thrown into the water. Inside the sunken sub, a group of survivors gathered in the forward torpedo room. They used the Monson lung escape breathing devices to make a desperate ascent to the surface. Only 5 men made it out alive. 9, including Kane, were captured by the Japanese. 78 crewmen died. The Tang was sunk by her own weapon, a weapon designed to be invisible, which ended up being invisible to its own crew until it was too late. The tragedy of the Tang highlighted the dangers of the new technology. The electric torpedoes required careful maintenance, and their guidance systems were delicate. It was a weapon that demanded respect, both from its target and its user. The stealth of the Mark 18 opened up a new theater of war that the Japanese thought was safe, their own harbors. Japanese commanders believed that shallow harbor entrances were secure. A submarine wouldn't dare enter because it could be easily spotted from shore, and its torpedo wakes would be instantly visible in the calm water. Ships loaded with troops and supplies would assemble in the harbors, waiting for escorts before heading out into the open ocean. American submarine commanders realized that the Mark 18 changed the rules of shallow water engagement. They began to perform harbor penetration missions. Submarines would creep into the harbor mouths at night, running silent on electric motors. They would sit on the bottom, sometimes in only 60 feet of water. They would wait for dawn. As the Japanese ships weighed anchor and began to move out in a neat column, the submarine would fire. Mark 18s would streak across the calm harbor water. Again, no bubbles. No wake. Ships would explode right in the harbor mouth. It was terrifying for the Japanese. They were being attacked inside their own house. The harbor defenses, shore batteries, patrol boats, would open fire widely at the water, churning up the mud, but they had no idea where the attack was coming from. The American submarines would fire all their tubes, sink 2 or 3 ships, and then slip back out to sea in the confusion. This tactic paralyzed Japanese shipping. Captains refused to leave port. Ships piled up in the harbors, unable to move supplies to the starving garrisons on the Pacific Islands. The Japanese realized that there was no sanctuary left. The invisible killer could follow them anywhere there was enough water to float. The Mark 18 was a wonder weapon, but inside the cramped hull of a submarine, it was also a ticking time bomb. The power source for the torpedo was a massive lead-acid battery. It was essentially a giant car battery. These batteries required constant, dangerous maintenance. The submariners, the torpedo men, had to check the electrolyte levels regularly. The danger was twofold. First, sulfuric acid. In rough seas, the acid could spill. If it came into contact with seawater in the bilges, it created chlorine gas, a deadly poison that could incapacitate the entire crew in minutes. Second, and even more terrifying, was hydrogen gas. When the batteries were being charged, they vented hydrogen. Hydrogen is highly explosive. A single spark, from a tool hitting metal or an electrical switch, could ignite the gas. The resulting explosion inside the sealed pressure hull of a submarine was usually fatal to the boat and everyone on board. The torpedo rooms had to be constantly ventilated to clear the hydrogen. The Mark 18s had to be withdrawn from their tubes every few days to be exercised, partially run to keep the batteries fresh. This maintenance was back-breaking, stressful work performed in a hot, humid steel tube. The torpedo men lived with the knowledge that the weapon designed to kill the enemy could easily kill them first if they made the slightest mistake. The success of the Mark 18 was bought with the sweat and risk of these unsung mechanics who wrestled with high-voltage acid baths deep underwater. By late 1944 and into 1945, the effect of the Mark 18 on the Japanese war effort was total. Japan was an island nation that relied almost entirely on imported resources, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore, and rice from the mainland. The American submarines, armed with their invisible torpedoes, cut the supply lines. The statistics are staggering. In 1942, Japan imported nearly 20 million tons of cargo. By 1945, that number had dropped to less than 3 million tons. The Japanese merchant marine was practically wiped out. The results were felt everywhere. In Japan, civilians were starving. Rationing was severe. People were eating acorns and sawdust to survive. Factories shut down because there were no raw materials. Crucially, the Imperial Japanese Navy ran out of fuel. The massive battleships like the Yamato and the remaining aircraft carriers were trapped in port. They couldn't sail to fight because their bunkers were empty. When the Yamato sailed on its final suicide mission in April 1945, it was fueled with the last remaining oil reserves of the entire nation. The Mark 18 torpedo didn't win the war by sinking warships in dramatic battles, though it did that too. It won the war by sinking slow, rusty tankers and freighters. It strangled the Japanese economy steadily, silently, and invisibly. The Japanese commanders who had mocked the White Snake steam torpedoes in 1942 were now presiding over a nation that was dying of economic asphyxiation caused by the weapon they never saw coming. As the American technological stranglehold tightened, the Japanese response became increasingly desperate. They couldn't match American science or manufacturing. They couldn't build better sonar or faster escorts. So, they turned to the only resource they had in abundance, the willingness of their young men to die. They created the Kai-10. It was a human-guided torpedo. Essentially, a standard Type 93 long-lanced torpedo with a small cockpit cut into the middle for a pilot. The pilot would be sealed inside. He had a small periscope. He would be launched from a mother submarine and steer the torpedo into an American ship, killing himself in the explosion. It was the underwater equivalent of the kamikaze. The contrast was stark. The United States was using its industrial might to build high-tech, unmanned robots, the Mark 18, to kill the enemy without risking American lives. Japan was asking its soldiers to become the guidance system for their weapons. The Kai-10 program was a failure. They were difficult to launch, hard to steer, and suffered from mechanical breakdowns. Hundreds of pilots died in training accidents or were lost at sea without ever finding a target. Only 2 American ships, a tanker and a destroyer escort, were confirmed sunk by Kai-10s during the entire war. The Kai-10 was a symbol of the technological and moral bankruptcy of the Japanese war machine at the end. They were trying to counter the silent efficiency of the Mark 18 with noisy, futile human sacrifice. It was a tragic admission that they had no answer to the American technological juggernaut. When the war ended in August 1945, the U.S. Navy submarines returned to Pearl Harbor and other bases in triumph. Their crews lined the decks in their dress whites. Flying from the conning towers were their battle flags. The flags were covered in symbols, small rising suns for warships sunk, and merchant flags for cargo ships sunk. Some flags were so crowded with kills there was barely room for the fabric. The U.S. submarine force represented less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel. Yet, they were responsible for sinking 55% of all Japanese ships lost during the war. They had completely destroyed the Japanese merchant marine and crippled its navy. The cost was high. 52 American submarines were lost, and over 3,500 submariners died, the highest casualty rate of any American service branch. But their revenge for Pearl Harbor was total. The key to their success in the second half of the war was the Mark 18 electric torpedo. It was imperfect. It was slow. It was dangerous. But it gave the submarine captains the one thing they needed most: invisibility. It allowed them to dictate the terms of the engagement. The Japanese commanders had started the war laughing at American torpedoes that announced their presence. They ended the war watching their empire sink beneath the waves, destroyed by a weapon that killed them without ever making a sound. The silent service had delivered the final, silent blow.